First things first, full game spoiler warning for Xenoblade Chronicles, Xenoblade Chronicles X, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Additionally, minor spoiler warnings for Future Connected and Torna the Golden Country. I won't be talking too much about specific story points, but I'll be having clips from certain parts of all three games and we'll be discussing the plots of the games in general detail, including some major plot spoilers. Before I get into the main bulk of this video, I want to give some context for what this video will be and a few disclaimers. This section will mostly be about the ground rules for this video, so if you don't care about that, there will be a few million timestamps in the description and chapters on the video. First and foremost, this isn't going to just be me bashing on the Xenoblade games for multiple hours or however long this video ends up being. This is going to be me giving my criticisms of the games, explaining why I don't like these aspects, and what value I can see in them, etc. If you're the average Twitter user looking for someone shitting on Xenoblade 2, you'll have to look elsewhere. However, if you are the average Twitter user looking for things to shit on the Xenoblade games about, you've come to the right place. Second, this video is going to be more or less just me talking, featuring my terrible mic quality. I'm also probably going to be rambling and stumbling over my words a decent amount despite this being fully scripted. This is because I'm terrible at wording. These topics will also be in no particular order outside of being sorted by game. I'll have some footage of each game playing in the background, but in general it won't be related to what I'm talking about. I'm mostly just adding the video so that this isn't just me talking into the void for hours. Third, I've only played episode 1 of Xenosaga and I haven't played any of Xenogears, so I don't feel qualified to trash talk those games yet. That combined with the fact that those games will never be re-released on a modern console means that they'll have to be left out of this video. Next, as mentioned at the very start of this video, I won't be going into specific plot points about the games, or getting too nitpicky about certain minor details. If I focused on every individual little point that I take issue with, we'd literally be here all day, and this video is already going to be long as is. I will, however, be talking about things that I don't like in general, or aspects of the storytelling, and will be providing specific examples to give context to what I mean. Next, I'm not really going to be considering things that are external to the games themselves. I know there have been interviews or outside stories that relate to the plots of these games or various references to certain ideologies or philosophies and such, and I just don't care. I'm aware of a decent number of these, but not all of them, and it's really not worth the effort for me to dig them up. This video is about the games, and if something is external to the games, there's a good chance people playing the games won't have access to it while playing them. That's the end of that, and I don't really care to deal with the gymnastics of, oh, but if you knew this, then it'd be different. Next, I want to make it clear that all the things stated in this video are my own opinions and based on my own experience. Because of this, there's the possibility that either I'll forget to talk about something, or that you'll have different opinions than me. There's not much I can do about the former, but if the latter is true for you, just remember that all my opinions are objectively true and based, though you are entitled to your own wrong opinions. Finally, if anything I say here upsets you because either I was too hard or not hard enough on one of the games, feel free to leave me an angry comment telling me about it. If I get enough angry comments, I'll pin my favorite one. In seriousness though, I don't care how you choose to respond to this. Either ignore it and move on with your life, give some discourse in either the comments or a video of your own, or anything in between. With all that out of the way, let's get into the video proper. General problems. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about a few general problems that are issues across all the games. These are all relatively minor and I don't have a lot to say about them, so I'm grouping them here so I don't repeat myself in every game section. RNG drops on collectibles, gear, etc. I get drops being random. It's an RPG. However, the randomness of the gear system in all of the Xenoblade games tends to be extremely annoying. On a casual playthrough, this isn't the biggest deal in the world because you can get by with whatever random item drops and or shop gear you happen across. However, whenever you're trying to optimize, this becomes extremely tedious in every one of these games. Xenoblade X has it the worst in my opinion because of the random manufacture, weapon armor tables, and battle traits, but it definitely exists and can be very annoying in each game. The other major annoyance of this is collectibles. This is annoying in every game, but at least in my opinion, it's the least terrible in XC2. In XC1 and XCX, you're simply collecting item orbs and hoping to find what you want, maybe with an idea of where to pick up orbs if you have the wiki open. In XC2, you at least have blades with skills like botany and such to increase the amount of drops you get. However, there is no game in which this is not at least a little bit annoying, and the only thing keeping it from being outright bad is that collectibles are largely not necessary for progressing the main story. XC2 speedrunners in shambles. weather/weather exclusive things. You know, I could excuse this in OG XC1. It was the first game of the style Monolith Soft had made. At least Xenosaga 1 was very different from what I played, and I'm assuming the other sagas and Gears were different in gameplay style than the Xenoblade games. However, XCX was more or less just as annoying to grind for specific weather in, and in XC2 it was still random. Honestly, if nothing else changes in XC3, I hope they make it either a less tedious way to change the weather to what you want, or make it to where there's fewer to nothing that requires specific weather. Random weather is probably one of the most annoying mild inconveniences in this series, and it's been a problem in all 3 games. Awkward animations. Every game has some animations throughout that are a bit awkward looking, stiff, or otherwise a bit distracting from the rest of what's going on. This isn't a massive issue, and it doesn't bother me too much due to them generally being pretty infrequent, but it's something that does come up every once in a while in each game, so I wanted to make mention of it in the general problem section, since it can detract from the moment when it occurs. Affinity grinding. This is the least enjoyable part of any of the Xenoblade games in my opinion, and it's terrible in all of them. All of them have some decently fast way to do it. You have Stormy Belagon in XC1, support missions in XCX, and love sources/pouch items in XC2. However, it's still an incredibly tedious process, takes several hours, and is required to do certain things, affinity missions for arts in XCX, and combat optimization in XC1 and XC2. There's not much more to say about this other than that it's super annoying, and I hope that they have a better system in any future games. Xenoblade Chronicles 1/Definitive Edition. This section will be mostly focused on XCDE, though I may make occasional mentions of OG XC1. The main reason for this is that, in my opinion, it's not super productive to harp on issues that have effectively already been fixed. If you want, though, just imagine I spent about 30 minutes talking about how horrible it feels to control and how uncooperative the AI party members are, because that's most of what I would complain about in XC1. I've been playing a lot of XCDE over the past year and a half or so I have a lot of experience to draw on for this. I've also played with a bunch of different aspects of the game and a lot of different challenges, from speedrunning to time attacks to low-level fights to solo super bosses. Because of this, expect me to have a lot to say about this game and all of its problems, because I know all of them pretty well at this point. For the structure of this, I'm mostly going to be starting off with the gameplay-based criticisms, then I'll move on to the more story-based criticisms. This probably still won't be grouped in the most logical way, but I'll do my best to put them in a coherent order. Visions. Visions are conceptually, and in the casual playthrough, a pretty solid mechanic. They allow for you to swing the momentum of the fight back in your favor, allow for you to get a large burst of tension from breaking tags, and stall the enemy from attacking for 8 to 16 seconds. One of the best parts about Visions, in my opinion, is that on the casual playthrough, most people don't realize how beneficial they can be, so the swings that come from them feel like something that the player has legitimately caused through their own skill and decision making, rather than a mechanic that's weighted heavily in their favor. However, there's a few things that greatly hold this mechanic back. First and most obvious is how slow they are. A vision can take upwards of 10 seconds for the first trigger, and then it generates a slowdown effect every time the vision changes. This can happen from a character healing out of kill range, the target switching, a buff or debuff increasing or decreasing the damage received from the vision, and any number of other things. This can quickly result in the gameplay being dragged to a screeching halt, depending on when the vision triggers and what the party setup is. Next, and this might seem nitpicky, but it's how changing the result of a vision changes the music playing to Vision's React. Every time you break a vision tag, then this song stays for the rest of combat. If you've played this game for a reasonable amount of time, I don't think I need to explain why this can be annoying. Suffice to say though, having one song completely overwrite any other combat theme really detracts from the gameplay experience. Finally, I want to address a complaint that I often see but don't entirely agree with. I sometimes see people say that Shulk is the only real way to deal with visions, but this just simply is not true in many cases. Depending on the situation and your point of the game, you have plenty of other options such as healing/shield bullet with Sharla, daze from either Dunban's Thunder or out of Topple, reflection on Melia, revive auras on Dunban and Rhine, having your tanks draw aggro, shield drones 2 or certain defensive Fiora builds, removing buffs/auras through either Tempest Kick or Mind Blast respectively to reduce damage, inflicting debuffs such as Strength, Ether, or Agility down with Ryan, Fiora, or Dunban to reduce damage, activating a chain attack to survive the art, then healing or toppling to buy yourself time to recuperate, or any other number of things that I'm not thinking of right now. On top of this, warning a party member gives you access to any of their arts regardless of their talent gauge or cooldowns. To me, the problem here is that Shulk is often the most convenient option, encouraging people to just use Shulk, since then they'll always have an anti-vision button at the ready. Combine this with Shulk's other utility, such as armor spam, party meter building, some amount of healing, etc., and it can be easy to see how Shulk can feel like a mandatory part of a good party. Additionally, I do want to make the point that with how XC1's combat is, visions are a bit of a necessary evil. The game's combat doesn't work nearly as well without them, as shown in Future Connected, as many strong enemies are able to one-shot either party members or force a party wipe with some of their stronger arts. This means that the trade-off for removing visions would be having to know a fight before going into it, or risking getting rolled by something you have no way to react to. The reason I bring this up isn't to defend visions, it's to make a point that there might be other problems with the game's balance a bit more fundamentally. At the end of the day though, I won't really be going into that aspect of it in super great detail, because visions help bring other things like that back into line, thus making the whole thing come together somewhat cohesively, despite the problems with visions themselves. Soul Read. Soul Read is an aura that a decent number of Telethia have, both bosses and normal enemies. The biggest problem I have with Soul Read is that it's often more annoying than difficult to deal with. The main options you have to deal with it are to remove the aura with either Purge or Mind Blast, both of which rely on having talent built, inflicting Daze with Dunban's Thunder, which requires player-controlled Dunban since the AI won't use Thunder, or having an Ether Party so that you can hit despite the increased evasion. The problem with this to me isn't that there is no counterplay, I just listed off several examples of it, but rather that the counterplay is too specific. Either you need to play an Ether Party, which you might not have the skills, arts, or equipment to effectively do, or you just need to have one of these specific options, which aren't always available, and also one of them is limited to Ether Parties anyways. While it is a decent mechanic in theory, and is noteworthy to the plot, it just ends up feeling like a, oh, you can't hit anymore, I hope you have one of these options ready, smiles, mechanic, which I can't say that I'm a fan of. Spikes. I don't necessarily have a problem with spikes in general. I think they're usually a fine mechanic that makes some enemies different from others and adds gear dependency or Monado art usage requirements to fighting certain strong enemies, modifying their difficulty based on the spike, and also encouraging toppling for certain enemies while discouraging for others, giving different enemies different feels and pacings to their fight. One of the big improvements that Definitive Edition made was showing when an enemy has an active spike, which greatly reduces the annoyance of running into an enemy and having to wonder whether or not they have a spike. Additionally, they made it so AI party members won't kill themselves on enemies' damage counter spikes in Definitive Edition, which is also a great improvement over the original XC1. That being said, there are two main problems that I still have with the spike system. The first is that there is no way to differentiate between a spike that inflicts a debuff and one that inflicts damage. Which of these two an enemy has can greatly change how you approach the fight, so not knowing which it is until either trying the fight or checking the wiki is really annoying. Also, to address this now, while simply knowing whether an enemy spike does damage or inflicts a debuff doesn't help against all spikes, such as Avalanche Abbacy or Fireworks Galdicia, where you'd need to know the specific debuff for it to be helpful, it would definitely be better than knowing nothing other than that there is a spike. The second of my issues is that there is still no way to know if an enemy has a topple spike until it's already toppled. This is a problem for a few reasons. One of these is that the spike indicators take a bit of time to pop up, meaning that depending on the spike, you could potentially lose a ton of HP, or have your whole party debuffed before you even realize that there's an active spike. A compounding factor of this is that down spikes tend to be significantly more powerful than normal spikes, inflicting stronger debuffs like topple or daze, or just dealing over 1,000 damage back per hit. Spikes aren't an inherently terrible mechanic in my opinion, but the implementation of them tends to detract more than it adds. Despite how I frame this, dealing with spikes in general is annoying, regardless of whether or not you know that they're coming. Until late game, for damage spikes you basically have to choose between committing 3+ gem slots, taking some damage but not the full spike damage, spamming Purge with Shulk, or topple locking. The former two of these are pretty annoying for obvious reasons, and the latter two are relatively boring for gameplay. Unique monsters respawning. So, in the original XC1, I can excuse this. It was their first time having something like this in a game, and they probably just wanted to have something that would make it so that they don't always come back, but still have it be possible for them to come back in case you wanted to fight them again later. However, XC2 had tombstones, which was a great way of solving this problem and were incredibly convenient for a number of reasons. I really can't excuse the lack of a mechanic similar to tombstones in Definitive Edition, and I'm not even going to try to defend it. This was a terrible decision and they should have fixed it. Outside of fixing the terrible respawning mechanic, this also would have improved the weather-specific mechanic, as you wouldn't need to reset the clock for a specific weather, and then also grind for the 30% respawn if you wanted to refight one of these UMs. Optimal combat is boring. One of the common complaints about this game is that the combat is boring in Resident Sleeper, and either you're AFK waiting for art cooldowns or just topple locking or killing things in a single chain attack. I'm not going to argue with this because I don't entirely disagree with it, but I'm not going to focus on it in this section. Instead, I'm going to focus on what I believe the root cause of this issue is. Also, just before anyone gets upset at me for brushing it off, we'll talk about the Resident Sleeper art cooldown parts of the combat in the next subsection, just not in this section since I primarily want to be focusing on non-early game combat. This section is also going to assume that you're in late to post game, where you have access to most to all options available. The problem I think this stems from is that the most optimal strategies are simply boring. There's plenty of other options which are more interesting, as realistically you can make just about any party work in this game as long as you have some fundamental synergy. The problem is that 9 times out of 10, the best option is the one where the opponent can't fight back. This causes people to default to one of the two aforementioned options, topple locking or one chain killing. I feel like this is a fundamental problem with how the game is balanced, something that will probably be talked about at length throughout the Xenoblade 1 section. The problem isn't a lack of interesting options, as there are certainly some interesting options available at all points of the game. The problem is simply that these aren't the best strategies, and the player playing the game will choose the best strategy they can find. Additionally, given that these strategies are generally easy to pull off, easy to figure out, and overall boring, it leads to this being the way most people see the game's combat. Boring. The combat is boring and AFK, waiting for art cooldowns or just topple locking or killing things in a single chain attack. Don't put all that in the chapter name. Let's start this off by saying that I think that there's two different problems with the art cooldown system, and that these problems aren't exclusive to this game. However, the problems of them are a bit different in each of the games, so we'll be talking about this subsection in each game's individual section separately. To start things off, let's start off with talking about early game. In the early parts of the game, art cooldowns are very long, you typically don't have a ton of arts, and you have to spend large amounts of time simply waiting for arts to come off cooldown. This leads to a lot of doing nothing in combat, which while it's decent for getting a handle of the combat system, can quickly become boring and tedious. Additionally, the lack of a reasonably diverse party until about halfway through Machina further limits what you can do and try out, meaning that the first portions of the game can be quite a slog. The second side of this problem is for late to post game. Whenever you get access to level 10 arts and start maxing them, or level 12 arts in Definitive Edition, art cooldowns are very short. This leads to the opposite problem of early game. Instead of having to wait for arts to be available to be able to do anything, art cooldowns are short enough to be spammed without consequence. This leads to the opposite problem as the start of the game, where you still don't have to think in combat half the time because you can just click arts whenever they're off cooldown to maximize DPS. Now of course, there is a bit more depth to the combat than just that, with things like managing buffs, debuffs, and auras. However, overall I think that this is a decent problem with the game, and I feel like it's worth being called out as such. Chain attack synergy. One of the most important things about party compositions in XC1 in general is their chain attack synergy. That is to say, it is incredibly important to be able to build up high chain attack combos and deal large amounts of damage during chain attacks. This causes some pretty decent restrictions on party compositions that can be more limiting than I think that they should be. The most noteworthy thing that this does, in conjunction with other problems with her playstyle, is that it makes Charlotte effectively worthless as a party member. Her arts are primarily blue, which are largely not useful in chain attacks. Additionally, she only has one red art, 2 purple arts, with only one of those purple arts actually dealing damage. Charlotte can be useful in some parties under certain circumstances, but her lack of synergy puts her at an even greater disadvantage when compared to non-Charlotte parties. Another thing that this does is it artificially limits which characters are good together. For example, Ricky and Melia have great synergy as ether users for strong DOT chain attacks. However, picking a third party member can be difficult. Ideally, you'd want a party member with multiple purple arts to synergize with Ricky's DOT arts, and decent tanking capabilities to help keep Melia alive. However, looking at the other characters, Charlotte and Fiora are the only two characters that actually have more than one purple art. Charlotte has problems fitting into parties in general, as mentioned before, which really restricts you to either using Fiora, having a character who doesn't contribute much to DPS, or being limited to only having one purple art on the third character. You can definitely make all of these situations work, but the problem isn't whether or not you can make them work. The problem is that it creates a somewhat arbitrary restriction on party viability that's independent of how good the characters are on their own. Level-based debuffs. So in theory, this is a decent mechanic. It lets you have a stat curve that doesn't require any major stat jumps to have small changes in levels matter, as you go from enemies being on par with you to significantly easier to defeat in just a few levels. This can make you see your characters growing stronger, and most players playing blind aren't going to realize that this is mostly through artificial means. That being said, this system is super flawed. A single level can make you go from an enemy being nearly impossible to beat without specific strategies, to being relatively easy with most competent strategies when enemies go from a red border to a yellow border. While there are ways to combat the debuffs, such as Serene Heart on Dunban, Enlightenment linked to ether attackers, or Night Vision and Agility up gems, these tend to be a bit specific and aren't super obvious if you don't fully understand the level system. Additionally, things like Night Vision aren't available in good supply or level until decently late in the game, and Enlightenment is the final skill on one of Melia's skill trees, making them further difficult to use as a way of combating this in early to mid game. Additionally, as a bit of a personal gripe, I do find it a bit weird and janky that there's a massive spike from 5 to 6 levels below the enemy, and then relatively large increases in debuffs per level from levels 6 to 10 below the enemy, then basically no changes for anything past level 10. Technically you get more block rate penalty, but if you're hurting from anything over minus 50% block rate, you've done something really wrong. The changes leading up to red border are relatively gradual, and beating even strong enemies with a yellow border isn't that difficult of a task all things considered. However, trying to beat weak enemies with a red border is very difficult still, and it just feels weird and poorly balanced. This level system leads to a decent amount of jank with the super bosses in particular, with things like them all having relatively low stats compared to what you'd expect. The system also leads to things like how evasion tanking is almost impossible against the super bosses, despite being basically the best way of tanking for the majority of the game. This leads to the most practical method for casual players to beat the super bosses being topple locking, which is super unrewarding, and also see the section where I talked about how boring playing the game like this is. Additionally, this system has some weird implications for challenge fights in this game, where fighting things at a level disadvantage more than 10 levels only really affects the fight via lowering your stats, which is relatively minimal since most individual levels don't increase your stats by much, especially as you get into the higher levels, typically 80+. As I've said before, this doesn't really affect the average player, but it does affect people who really want to get into the game, and it's something that I've been annoyed by quite a bit when picking levels for challenge runs and not wanting them to feel too arbitrary. Quote-unquote difficulty settings. After XC2, it's a bit unfortunate that XCDE didn't include any difficulty settings. While OG XC1 didn't have any, and thus it shouldn't have been an expectation, that doesn't mean that it's not a little bit disappointing. While the inclusion of Expert Mode to help control your level and Casual Mode to avoid level-based agility penalties definitely helped in some ways, they're both pretty flawed systems for handling some of the game's balance problems, and they don't really do what they say on the label. First of all is that Expert Mode and Casual Mode sound like they're an easy and hard mode, which they are not at all. Expert Mode is simply a way to set your level to whatever you want and store bonus EXP from exploring/quests, similar to Ins and XC2. Casual Mode does a bunch of things to make the game easier, which vary in how much sense they make and how consistent they are. The changes with Casual Mode are doubling party meter gain, halving damage taken, doubling damage dealt, greatly reducing the effect of spikes, and removing level-based agility modifiers. This is a weird selection of things, with decisions like only removing agility modifiers from the level-based debuffs, then altering damage taken/dealt altogether but leaving the damage penalties/bonuses alone. Additionally, it's worth noting that the level-based agility modifiers include the ones in your favor, so sometimes lower-level enemies will still be able to hit you, and you might struggle to hit enemies that are lower level than you. The biggest problem I have with casual mode is that it fundamentally changes the game's mechanic, does so inconsistently, and they're not always in your favor. Further, the fact that these are all or nothing changes means that players who don't want to deal with agility penalties for being underlevel also have to deal with fights being trivialized from the damage changes, doubled party meter, and trivializing of spikes depending on the enemy. Finally, casual mode further compounds the issue I've already discussed, that the optimal combat is boring. Topple locking is by far one of the best ways to approach almost any fight, and with party meter generation doubling, it becomes even easier to do so. Taking one of the easiest and most boring playstyles and making it even easier to execute isn't a good thing, even if this change is tied to an optional, quote, easy difficulty setting. Time attack. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm probably the person who has spent the most time in the time attack mode of XCDE. Therefore, I'm very qualified to talk about how terrible this mode is. While I personally enjoy grinding time attacks over time, this is honestly probably one of the most objectively terrible things in the game. First, let's start off with restricted time attacks. The biggest problem with restricted mode for time attacks is the lack of tools. Now, I get that the idea of these is that you don't get to customize and you have to work with what's given to you. However, that doesn't make it enjoyable to play the absolutely garbage builds the game gives you. It would be one thing if you simply had to make some slightly janky builds work and that you kind of had to figure out how to play them through these fights. That could be fun. However, half the time the parties have no synergy, meaning that it's incredibly difficult to get halfway decent chain attacks without your AI party members having their talent built. And the builds that you do have typically are missing their best arts. Compound this with how you aren't even given the tools to effectively deal with the enemies a decent amount of the time, such as He of the Metal Face having no real way to deal with custom Grand Shot outside of activating Chain, which you can only really do once while he is able to spam the art. All this together makes restricted time attacks really unfun casually, and terrible to try to actually improve your times on, which is largely the point of a time attack mode. Next, let's talk about the free categories and the major problems with those. The biggest issue with these is that they have no level restriction on you at all, while the enemies are relatively low level for almost every time attack. In fact, the only time attack where the enemies are even close to you in level are He of the Metal Face and Uniquely Disadvantaged. Even with this though, every TA has a speedrun strat that involves one-shotting at least one enemy in each TA, even in the glitchless categories. I personally find the TAs pretty fun to run, but the enemies are so weak that it limits your ability to be creative with strategies for quickly clearing out the enemies. As mentioned for restricted time attacks, this is a time attack mode, and the main goal should be to improve your times. Thus, having your creativity for strategies be limited by how weak the enemies are can make it incredibly easy to lose interest, since you can clear several of them very quickly with basically the same strategy. Next, let's talk about problems with the time attack mode in general. One of my biggest complaints is that there's no quick restart like there is in XC2. Now, from what little I know about speedruns of the Land of Challenge, I think it's still optimal to quit out between attempts anyways. However, not even having the option to quick restart and having to wait through 2 loading screens and a menu makes these time attacks a massive slog to make attempts of. As this is a time attack mode and the main goal should be to improve your time, I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, it's not ideal to have to wait around about 1 minute between attempts when the average time for the free time attack records is about 16 seconds, and the longest record in a restricted category is less than 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Now, I know not everyone who does time attacks casually will be grinding as hard as me or the other record contenders have, but even if you're only doing a decently fast strategy and only grinding a little bit to get a decent time, it's likely that you'll get bored of the tedium of having to restart your attempts to improve your time. This is one of the biggest problems in the time attack mode in my opinion, and it's made even worse when considering the problems with both restricted and free modes that I've talked about previously. Finally, I want to briefly mention the annoyance that is Knob on Stone grinding. This is mostly annoying because of the aforementioned long amount of time having to be spent in loading screens, but it's also annoying based on the fact that Knob on Stone rewards have randomness as to how much you get. The main thing to grind Knob on Stone for is level 12 art manuals, which admittedly most people probably aren't going to grind for. However, that doesn't make it any less annoying that you'll likely have to grind Knob on Stone on these tedious to grind time attacks for multiple hours to get all the art books for all of the good arts on all the characters in the game. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that there are a decent amount of glitches associated with the time attack mode of the game, but I'm not going to be talking about those because they're not really within the scope of this video. While yes, they could be seen as flaws with the game, they're not really something you'll run into unless you're actively trying to glitch the game. Exploring. Overall, the exploration in this game, and all Xenoblade games for that matter, is pretty good. However, the slow rate of movement without quick step gems can be frustrating, and this is made worse in the early game when there aren't many good sources of quick step. Once you gain access to decent level quick step gems, the problem doesn't just go away though. Since you're committing gem slots to making exploration take fewer eternities, you're essentially put into the position of needing to decide between giving up gems to improve your build, such as strength or agility up, giving up movement speed, making the world take more time to explore, or constantly switching between gems based on whether you're fighting or wandering, which is time consuming in its own right and doesn't always have clean-cut lines, since you often fight enemies while exploring. Overall, the issue of quickstep is the worst in this game out of any other in the series in my opinion, but even then it's not that terrible. It's a bit annoying, but it's something you can deal with since the game isn't that difficult to the point of requiring every gem slot to go to things that are useful for combat. Landmark distribution. This problem is more prevalent in some areas than others, and it's a pretty common complaint that people have about the game. To keep it brief, there's a decent number of areas in the game with either not enough landmarks for how big the area is, or there won't be landmarks near places you frequently need to return to for quests. Areas that come to mind are some parts of Arid Sea, the upper level of Alchemoth, Valak Mountain, and Bionis Leg, specifically with reference to areas like Traveler's Rest, which you're returning to repeatedly for quests. Part of the frustration for me isn't that this is a universal problem in the game, it's actually the opposite. The majority of the maps in XC1 have decent landmark distribution, and have landmarks near places you'll be wanting to return to. However, these few areas with the problem are the ones that'll often stand out and detract from the whole. Jumping physics in Definitive Edition. Jumping in XCDE is incredibly janky for no real reason. Well, there kind of is a reason for some of it. They were trying to prevent some of the exploits and skips from the original XC1. However, the changes they made to compensate for this, among some other changes, make the platforming in XCDE feel a lot worse than it needs to. The first thing I want to talk about is a specific case. That is the case of Hollow Bone. Hollow Bone is a lot more jank to go through in XCDE than it is in OG XC1 because the jumping physics were changed to make the jump a bit lower, but the geometry of Hollow Bone wasn't changed at all. This is the only real instance of required platforming in the game, at least that I can think of, so it stands out for its jankiness. Slightly unrelated to the jumping physics, but the geometry of Hollow Bone also tends to be super janky, and likes to fling you off the floor and then kill you with fall damage, which is also pretty frustrating. The next thing I want to talk about is something that's commonly referred to as fast fall. This usually occurs when you're walking down a slope and jump, and results in you gaining a lot of downwards momentum very quickly. This has some applications in speedruns, but in normal gameplay it tends to get you killed when you're trying to jump somewhere and randomly get spiked and miss the jump. This last one's a bit of a nitpick, but it's annoying enough to where I wanted to bring it up. If you've played this game casually, you've probably noticed that you can't always maintain your momentum off of conveyors. The details of this aren't really worth explaining, but what's important to note is that this happens after riding an elevator. My personal guess for why this happens is that when riding an elevator, you get a flag set to prevent you from maintaining momentum to keep you from getting away with any shenanigans having to do with upwards momentum, but the flag doesn't get properly unset while leaving the elevator. I don't know for sure if this is the reason, and it doesn't really matter. What does matter though is that this leads to conveyors and maintaining momentum feeling confusing and inconsistent, which isn't what you want out of your game mechanics. Quests. Quests in this game have decent stories and whatnot, outside of the generic ones like Monster Quest 69, but there's still some things I'm going to complain about. The first of these is that even for named and important quest lines, they usually just boil down to, kill this enemy, or get me 5 of this item. I know that there's only so many different objectives you can make for quests in games like this, but there's still some quests that are more than this and actually involve things like exploring. However, the vast majority of quests still fall into this mundane and basic category of objectives, which is a bit unfortunate. The second main issue I take with quests is related to the landmark distribution issue discussed earlier. My issue here is basically that there are multiple quest chains that have NPCs you need to talk to at the start and end of every quest in the chain that are upwards of 30 to 45 seconds of walking from the nearest skip travel point. Now, I know that this isn't too bad if you only have to go there once or twice, but whenever you have to make the trip repeatedly, it can get very old very fast. The final issue that I have with quests in this game is Agnirtha. The fact that every single quest in that area is timed to whenever you complete the area, which takes about 6 to 7 minutes if you're just rushing the objectives, is just poor design in my opinion. Additionally, the fact that one of the Agnirtha-related quests is given by someone on the Fallen Arm further compounds my issue with this. Now, I'm honestly not 100% sure if you can still complete these quests during the Mechonis core section, but even if you could, that wouldn't fix the problem. The fact that getting to Agnirtha during this section requires such a lengthy detour, and you can't skip travel, just furthers the point that you really shouldn't be doing Agnirtha quests at that point, regardless of whether or not you technically can. Poorly explained mechanics. There are multiple mechanics in this game that people playing either don't know exist or probably aren't quite sure how they work. While most of the core mechanics are explained well, things like gems, chain attacks, and the break topple days, there are many minor mechanics that either aren't explained at all or aren't explained well enough for players to reasonably understand them. The first of these is level-based debuffs. I've already talked about these earlier, so I won't go into detail about how they work as a mechanic. Instead, I'll make the point that the game tells you about danger levels and about different enemy tag colors, but it doesn't really tell you much to indicate how they actually work. Hell, it doesn't even do anything to indicate that the debuffs are different based on specific level difference, not just danger level, i.e. not all red borders give the same debuffs. All it says is that enemies with higher danger levels are more difficult to hit and evade, which is technically correct, but it's not particularly useful information. The next of these is weight. As far as I know, the game doesn't ever actually tell you what this does, it just displays as a stat and says that there are skills that reduce it. While this is even worse in XC1, where it would simply give you a -1 agility per weight on the equipment screen, which is not how the weight stat works. For anyone who's curious, weight gives you a penalty of -weight percent to evasion chance, and -weight divided by 4 to hit chance. While the specifics of this aren't exactly super important for the player to know, it says something that I didn't know, that weight affected accuracy and evasion differently until I had collectively about 1800 hours between XC1 and XCDE. The last of these is a mechanic that I'm sure plenty of people don't even know exists: art accuracy. The basic idea of how this works is that talent arts get plus 25% accuracy, while normal arts get plus 5% accuracy per level. In OGXC1, normal arts would cap at 25% accuracy at level 5, while in XCDE, our accuracy increases for every art level. Now, once again, I understand that this not being explained in super specific detail is not super important to the average player, as they don't really need to know that. However, knowing the arts have higher accuracy than auto attacks, or that they increase in accuracy as you level them, could be useful. Further making this annoying is that the game even tells you in tutorials that the changes to arts are displayed in blue, but the accuracy is never mentioned anywhere. Now, none of these mechanics are super crucial to know in great detail, or even sometimes to know at all during a casual playthrough. However, some of these could be pretty good to know, and I've known people who have a lot of time in this game and think things like art accuracy are just them being superstitious. Things like these are useful to know how they work, even if only having a general idea, but the game does nothing to convey them to the player. Party Member AI. Now, I'm not going to hound too much on the AI in this game, because obviously the AI-controlled party members are going to be worse than the player-controlled ones. However, this doesn't excuse how impossibly terrible they are at times. I'll give a few specific examples in this subsection because I don't really know how else to convey my point. The first example of this is Shulk's AI. Now, Shulk's AI is actually pretty decent sometimes. He'll read visions and use things like speed or armor when they're applicable, use Battle Soul when he's far away from talent, use Light Heal when party members are low on HP, and will usually use arts whenever they're going to give their bonus effect, like using Buster on Mechon, Purge to remove auras, and some of his directional arts when he's on the right side. However, this also leads into what's wrong with Shulk's AI. The simplest way I can put this is, while yes, he does do all of these things at the right time, he also does them all at the wrong time. Shulk will sometimes just fire off a purge against enemies that don't need to be purged. Shulk will sometimes just spam out his arts regardless of positioning, drawing huge amounts of aggro and gaining no bonus effects. Shulk will use Buster and Enchant effectively on the first possible frame against Mechon, meaning he'll never have talent ready for chain attacks against them. Shulk will use speed or armor randomly at the start of battle without actually considering the fact that the enemy is like 20 levels lower than you. Now, this would be a bit silly if I was making this section just because Shulk is the only major example of this. However, this kind of thing applies to many of the other party members in this game. Ryan typically won't use Rage unless he already has aggro. Charlotte basically never cools off her own rifle, leading to her overheating and getting reduced healing due to her rifle's heat. Melee rarely keeps up elementals, meaning you'll rarely keep any useful buffs, or have any ready whenever you want to use a chain attack. Dunban doesn't use Thunder at all, even if there are enemies behind him. And these are just the examples I can think of off the top of my head. To be completely honest, the AI in this game definitely isn't the worst thing in the world. However, it does limit what you can do with parties, since some characters just simply can't use their arts right, and it limits who you can control and who you can leave on the AI, since the AI is so terrible at controlling certain characters. Minor jank/glitches. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition for the Nintendo Switch is certainly one of the games of all time. So I'm not going to be talking about the big glitches like TA glitch and things relating to it here. This is mostly going to be talking about the more minor things. Now, it would be silly for me to make an entire subsection on this if this was over things that only happen every once in a while. For example, I'm not making a subsection about this in XC2 when that game is known in the speedrunning scene for softlocking and crashing on loads. No, the reason why I'm making a section on these minor instances is that they're so common that I feel like you're unlikely to go a playthrough without having anything janky happen, and they can really pull you out of the experience of the game. Now, it'd be silly for me to list every instance of something like this that I know of. I'll make a jank showcase video on that eventually. I'm also not going to be showing videos of these things happening because I can't be bothered. However, to give a short list of examples to get the point across, there's the teleporting chest glitch, the revive light remaining after the fight, pathing locking, getting trapped in vision loops, enemy chain attacks not targeting anything, the boss respawning glitch, NPCs walking through the air, and hard locks when exiting menus or during load screens. For general jank, there's also things like characters running and jumping on walls, the aforementioned hollow bone collision, and AI party members clipping through railings. Most players probably won't run into most of these things, but many players will run into a few, and almost all players will run into at least some amount of jank. While the severity of these janky situations definitely varies, the amount of them and the consistency at which they happen is more than I'm willing to just brush aside. Foreshadowing. So, JRPGs with heavy-handed foreshadowing are nothing new. However, it being relatively common doesn't mean that it's not bad in this game. There's plenty of things in this game that are super obviously foreshadowed. I don't want to just ramble off examples, but the two most prime cases would be Dixon's "I don't feel too good about deceiving these kids," and basically anything relating to Alvis in the first half of the game. We'll be talking more about Alvis specifically later. The thing I find a bit more annoying about the foreshadowing is that there are several cases where, despite how obvious the game makes it, it still acts like things should be coming as a surprise to the player. This definitely doesn't apply to everything in the game, as there's some things that I feel like are foreshadowed without being too obvious, but there's definitely several instances where I feel like it's a bit too obvious without the game itself reflecting that through its narrative. Overall, this isn't the worst thing in the world, but it definitely detracts from the experience. A lot of people like to give this game a lot of credit for the story, but this is one area where the game definitely struggles in my opinion. Alvis Specifically. Alvis' character is one of the things I find to be frustrating for a number of reasons. While I get that he's supposed to be the mysterious character that you don't know a lot about, the game gives a lot of conflicting information about him and makes it hard to get a really good grasp on exactly what he's supposed to be for most of the game. To give a short list, he starts off by saving you from Metalface with a Telethia, then he helps you kill Telethia and Machina, then you meet him in Alchemoth where he's all buddy pal. Then at the end of / after Alchemoth, he has some suspicious cutscenes with Lorithia and Zanza / Arglist. Then when you get to late game, he encourages Shulk but also sides with Zanza. He's just kind of all over the place, and while I know the story and why all of that is, it doesn't mean that it doesn't detract from the cohesiveness of things. Also, as mentioned in the previous subsection, he has a lot of heavy-handed foreshadowing surrounding him, which gives his character further issues. Also on the topic of Alvis, we know Dawn. Fiora's character. So, there are a lot of things that are bad about Fiora's character, but I'll try and keep it short and relatively concise. First, there's the fact that Fiora's entire character is literally just liking Shulk. In a game with a decent number of its main cast having at least some level of depth, albeit most are still nothing crazy, Fiora sticks out for being unbelievably bland. Even when she's led to the point of potentially having some depth with her life ending after Mayneth leaves, she still just defaults to, I wanna be with Shulk, ooh. I feel like the lack of any real character traits is a big slap in the face given how much she was the main driving force for basically the entire second third of the game. The story pulls you through all this in multiple areas and difficult fights, and the result is a character who has basically no redeeming character traits. There's plenty of specific cases and cutscenes I can point to if you are contributing nothing other than simping for Shulk, and the relationship and whatnot can definitely be a good payoff for some people, but with how bland Fiora is for the time after she returns, I can't bring myself to say anything good about her inclusion. Overly Shulk-Centric plot. While I understand that it makes sense for the plot to revolve around the main character, at least hear me out with this one. Shulk is centralized to every plot point in this game, even when the plot points aren't really about him. The most canned example of this would be Shulk stepping in at the end of Dunban's arc relating to Mumkar, and the cutscenes at the end of Sword Valley, which kind of cheapens any impact the scenes could have had with regards to Dunban's own growth. This also applies to a few other parts of the game, but I don't just want to go on a tirade of listing things off. Shulk being a central part of the story does help give it direction and keep things cohesive at times, but at others it just cheapens what is the end of different characters' arcs, or character growths. This isn't something that's just exclusive to this one moment with Dunban either, as it also applies to things such as the previous subsection of Fiora being a bad character, and various moments relating to Melia and Rhine. Antagonists. Most of the antagonists in this game, to be completely frank, suck. While characters like Mumkar can be fun villains who people love to hate, there's exactly one antagonist in this game who isn't entirely one-dimensional, that being Egil. While one-dimensional villains aren't inherently always a bad thing, as they can be fun like the aforementioned Mumkar, having antagonists with some complexity helps give people a reason to be more invested in the story, characters, and world. To use XC2 as an example, even the evil because evil antagonist of Malice has growth and development and more driving him than just that. He cares about Jin, wants to help him, and all those things are developed throughout the later parts of the game. Now compare that to Zanzar, who wants to kill all life because he's God and it's his right to kill all life. Now, I know that they explain it as being slightly more than just that, but that's effectively what it boils down to. While Egil is a good villain and helps to drive the story in the mid and early late game, his heavy lifting alone isn't enough to completely outweigh the bad. There are plenty of good characters and story moments in XC1, but the antagonists tend not to be them. General pacing. So overall, I think the pacing in this game is pretty good. It has its good moments and its bad, but I feel like things come together pretty well in the end. However, in terms of a game, I feel like the pacing can be not great at times. What I mean by this is in terms of the flow of cutscene / story heavy segments and gameplay / exploration heavy segments. Now, any RPG, or really any game with a plot for that matter, is going to have some sections where the story progresses more than others. However, I feel like there's something worth talking about here. Now, I'll talk about some of the issues with cutscene pacing itself in the next subsection, so for now, just keep that in the back of your mind as something that we'll be coming back to. For now though, let's talk about the general pacing of the game. There are multiple points in the game where there are about 30 minutes of borderline uninterrupted cutscenes. Maybe you have a tiny bit of walking in between, but in general it's just cutscene after cutscene with no real opportunity to explore or do combat in between. As I said earlier, I get the need to have exposition, especially after major plot points, but having things spaced out a little bit more at times like this can, at least in my opinion, make things a bit more enjoyable to play. I like my story-driven games, that's why I play a lot of RPGs. However, I don't like sitting down to play a game and just watching a movie instead. The next thing I want to talk about here is exactly the opposite, where entire areas will go by with basically no cutscenes or plot. Now, this is only really a thing in Mechonis Field and Central Factory, so it's definitely not as common, but I did want to acknowledge it. While you do have your driving motivation here, wanting to get Agnirtha to find Egil, there just isn't a lot of things going on in the story throughout these sections of the game. Now, I do get why this is from a narrative / world perspective, as basically all the Machina are on the Fallen Arm, and there's not really a whole lot for the party members to be doing along the way. However, little cutscenes similar to the one after Vents on the outside of Mechonis Field do help to fill the gap, and having maybe one or two or more of these throughout the whole of Mechonis might have helped to alleviate this problem for me. Pointless cutscenes. So this subsection is going to be pretty short, but this is just something I have a minor gripe about. But there's so many cutscenes in this game, where they either don't really serve any purpose, or are only a few seconds long, and then you have to walk 10 feet into another cutscene. The former of these would be mostly instances where there's some minor exposition like, oh hey, napalm merchants are here, how weird, let's go check that out. Then you go up to them and it has nothing to do with the plot, like when first entering Satora Marsh or the lamps in Tefra Cave. The latter would be things like the early parts of Prison Island 1 or Sword Valley, where you're just walking in a straight line from cutscene to cutscene. At the end of the day, these aren't super common, but they happen a decent number of times throughout the game. This could definitely be seen as nitpicking, and that's because it is, but it is genuinely something that annoys me when replaying this game and actually watching the cutscenes. The fans. This isn't something that's explicitly related to the game, but it's something that I feel is worth mentioning. Honestly, the fans of Xenoblade Chronicles 1/Definitive Edition are some of the most annoying people out there, and it can really make it difficult to get into the game due to how annoying it is to interact with other fans of the game. They can't take any criticism of their game, tend to be kind of elitists, and throw a hissy fit anytime literally anybody has something bad to say about their game. The game is generally good, but it definitely isn't perfect. Fans of this game need to both learn that, and learn that they don't need to pick a fight every time someone doesn't think that their game is God's gift to gaming. Xenoblade Chronicles X. Xenoblade Chronicles X is definitely the black sheep of the franchise. Because of this, there's a decent chance that most of my criticisms will be pretty different from those of the other games. Specifically, I'm probably only going to briefly mention the story in this section, as there's hardly any story to go over. Also, most of my discussion of combat will be related to late/post-game combat, as that's where the vast majority of my time with the game has been spent. I will still briefly cover some aspects of combat from earlier in the game, as well as relating to the issues I see from the game whenever I had less experience with it. Overall, I expect this to be the shortest section, though not because the game is lacking in flaws. Rather, I expect this to be because the flaws of this game tend to be very large, but there tends not to be a large number of different things for me to comment about. I haven't finished writing or recording the script yet, so let's see how correct this guess is. Required exploration and questing. So I honestly didn't feel like the required exploration was that big of an annoyance on my blind playthrough. With how the game is structured and presented, I personally found it to be quite fun to explore and found myself at the requirements whenever I was ready to start the chapters, with the exception of maybe a few Affinity missions. However, on subsequent playthroughs, where some of the magic of exploration was gone, I found it to be more of a slog. To be completely frank, I feel like required side questing is an objectively bad thing. If I have no option but to do side quests or similar activities to progress the main story, then they aren't side quests anymore. Side quests should be done through the motivation to do them, not because the game gives you some quota that you must do X amount. This is also a problem in Torna, but since Torna doesn't get its own section, I'm just going to mention it as a footnote here. The requirements usually make sense from a bit of a narrative perspective. Have a probe at the start of the continent you're going to head to next so that there's a reason why Frontier Nav is picking up things from there, or have explored continents or the world a certain amount, etc. However, in practice, meeting the requirements can be sort of a slog, especially if it's not something you really want to be doing, or if you'd rather just do the main plot and explore the game later. Spores Weather. This one is definitely nitpicky, but why does the Spores Weather exist? Who thought this was a good idea to make weather where you literally can't see anything, and the only thing you can do about it is reset the weather so that you can play the game again? There's other annoying weather effects like brimstone rain and EM storms dealing damage, which limits exploration and can be seen effectively having the same result by forcing you to reset the area. However, there's at least things you can do to make those weathers not be annoying. There's nothing you can do to make it visible during spores, so why does the weather exist to begin with? Rare spawn Tyrants. Just why? Making Tyrants respawn consistently was a really good change from XC1, and it made certain things like grinding equipment, which we'll get back to later, much more bearable. So why did they make some Tyrants only spawn sometimes? Even weather-exclusive Tyrants/UMs aren't as questionable as this to me. At least they spawn consistently. What's the point of making something required for either quests or recon sometimes just not be there? I'll never understand the logic of this, even if it is supposed to be for world-building reasons. World-building shouldn't interfere with gameplay, because you can have a good game with good gameplay and not a great world, but a great world without good gameplay just isn't a game worth playing. Now, these rare spawn Tyrants are by no means something that ruins the game experience and makes it not worth playing. But the point is that they get in the way of gameplay, which is something that you better have a good reason to do, and as far as I've ever been able to figure out, these don't have a good reason. Equipment system. In terms of customization, XCX has the best system in my opinion. The augment system is really good, and the fact that you can add slots to any equipment and that there's no real RNG in making the augments themselves. The problem is how battle traits work, especially with the different arms manufacturers. Without getting too much into the weeds of it, each arms manufacturer has a set of battle traits that they can have on each weapon and armor, as well as different attributes associated with them. For example, Meredith & Co. will typically provide ether weapons, Orphean Technology typically gives gravity weapons, and Sakuraba Industries will typically give physical weapons. Each brand provides more than one weapon attribute, but this is the general idea. Now, the problem that I take with this isn't how certain battle traits are limited to certain weapon attributes. That's more of a balance thing, and I think that it works decently well most of the time. No, what I take problem with is how much RNG is required in getting good equipment for a wide variety of reasons. First, let's talk about battle traits on equipment in general. When you get a piece of equipment, it will randomly have between 1 and 3 battle traits. I don't know what the rates on these are, but gold drops from enemies can still drop all 3 different amounts of battle traits. Of these battle traits, there's a random one generated for each of the slots you get based on some of the tables that I'm not enough of a nerd to fully understand. What this boils down to though is that getting equipment with even 2 out of 3 battle traits you want can take hours of grinding for a single piece, and this is before getting into all the other aspects of grinding for equipment. Now, let's talk about weapons specifically. There's a few enemies that only drop weapons, so you can at least guarantee a weapon drop. However, what weapons you get are random. I don't remember the exact math behind it, but having party members with the weapon you want and having the class you use have the weapon you want increases your chance of getting that weapon. For example, being a full metal Jaguar and having Elma in the party will give you good chances to get dual guns to drop. However, drops are not guaranteed and some random weapons will always show up. On top of this, all brands are thrown into the pool, making it take even longer to get the battle traits you want since you're rolling through all the different brands that can provide that weapon. Finally, let's talk about the armor specific problems. Different brands of armor are dropped by different types of enemies. There's a table out there which shows which enemies drop which type of armor if you care enough to look it up, but I won't really be going over it here. The problem with this system is that you're only guaranteed to get max level battle traits, which are on the Ultra Infinite and Boundless series, from enemies over level 65. However, not all enemy types have variants that are over level 65. This means that you'll have to grind enemies that are in the level 60 to 65 range that can drop both Ultra Regal and Ultra Infinite armor, which reduces the chances of getting the armor that you want. Now, not everyone is going to be going for perfect equipment. I have over 1500 hours in the game and I don't go for completely perfect equipment, basically ever. However, the problem isn't getting absolutely perfect equipment, because to be completely frank, that's not really necessary. There's very few things in the game that require perfect gear, with those typically being RP runs or various leaderboard runs. No, the problem is that it's difficult to get good gear. Even getting 2 specific traits you want is a massive commitment, and that's the problem with the gear system in this game. General ground combat. In my opinion, the ground combat in this game is the best combat in any Xenoblade game. However, it's far from a flawless system. I'll be talking about things relating to with or without overdrive specifically in some of the upcoming sections, but for right now I'm going to be sticking to general things. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about things such as general combat balance and feel. So first of all, let's talk about things that are overtuned. That's to say, honestly about half of the mechanics in this game. Now, people who know me and know what I've talked about with this game before know that I actually like about how everything is OP in this game and how that lets you basically run any build you want. However, that doesn't mean that I think that it's a good system or a relatively balanced system. First, let's go over some of the things that I consider to be overtuned so that we're all on the same page. By this, I'm mostly referring to extremely strong skills, strategies, and arts. To give a few specific examples, this would include things like Core Crusher, Decoy, Reflect, Attribute Resistance Stacking, Topple /Stun Locking, Blossom Dance, Offensive Stance, Astral Protection, and honestly basically any offensive TP art, or potential scaling art, in the game, as well as probably about half a dozen other things that I'm forgetting to name specifically. If you've played this game well into the post-game, chances are you're familiar with Ether Blossom Dance builds, which typically make use of multiple of these mechanics together. Aether Blossom Dance is generally considered to be the strongest build in the game, and can one-shot literally any enemy in the game with the right setup. See the intro to NL's Blossom Dance guide, where he literally one Blossom Dance kills Gradivis. The big problem with this is similar to that of XC1's combat. Some things being too strong and centralizing can invalidate other strategies. Even some of the things I've listed here are essentially obsolete when compared to Blossom Dance builds, such as resistance stacking, reflect, and astral protection builds, as they're more defensively oriented than offensively oriented. After all, why bother being able to survive an enemy's attacks if you can just set up Ghostwalker and have the enemy dead before they can break decoy? Now, outside of completely optimized gameplay, several other things can still be relevant, such as the full list of things that I have mentioned above and many more. However, there are some things that are effectively completely outclassed to the point of not being used outside of gimmicks and or personal challenges or enjoyment. For example, things like Conductive Strike plus Maximum Voltage builds are a lot of fun in my opinion, but they're effectively outclassed because Blossom Dance is a better potential art, Offensive Stance is a better aura for melee damage, and most of the damage from Maximum Voltage and Conductive Strike builds come from additive multipliers rather than base damage multipliers, which are less potent by comparison. Additionally, Conductive Strike specifically relies on having debuffs on the enemy, which further restricts its usefulness compared to a more generally useful attribute-related skill in Core Crusher. On top of this, outside of things that can be justified in a vacuum for fun, there are some mechanics that are just so weak compared to everything else that they're basically worthless. This basically just means certain support arts, spikes, and using Reflect as a means of DPS. We'll get into why I'm even bringing up that last one momentarily. Certain debuffs are useless because some means of offense and defense are so strong, and no relevant enemies in post-games are even vulnerable to them. This makes things such as arts that inflict virus not particularly useful outside of building TP during Overdrive. Spikes are basically useless for DPS because you usually just have to give up an offensive aura for them in exchange for minimal passive damage. Some of the spike auras do have other effects that are decent, but the spike effects are basically entirely useless outside of the most dedicated of meme builds. Additionally, we're not even going to talk about Electric Flush because that skill is just that terrible. Reflect is a great defensive option, but I still brought it up as a means of DPS here, so let's get into why that is. There's a skill called Double Reflect and augments called Reflect Damage Up, and these do exactly what they sound like and make reflected damage deal more damage back to enemies. Also, just for context, reflected damage is based on your resistances and the enemy's attacking stats, so you have to have low resistances and be fighting a strong enemy to make this deal even slightly passable damage. Why would you ever use these? I'm not really sure, which makes me wonder why they're even in the game. I guess they allow for certain meme builds, which I have played with before, but outside of that they're just another thing that is made completely worthless by opportunity cost. Outside of these things that are completely worthless, there are a few builds that are generally outclassed due to them being far less consistent than the common go-tos. These typically involve things with Sleep, which is effectively outclassed by Topple and Stun, and Evasion, which is inconsistent due to caps in Evasion and accuracy in this game, which we'll be talking about in a later subsection. Outside of things like this, certain weapon combinations aren't practical outside of specific situations. For example, something like one of my personal favorite weapon combinations in Gatling Gun and Knife is significantly less practical since it lacks any generally useful defensive options like Decoy, Reflect, or Astral Protection, and have to rely on either the inconsistent evasion tanking or the situational attribute resistance stacking. Now, as I've mentioned, there's nothing stopping you from using these kinds of builds still. One of the perks of the entire combat system being extreme and so many mechanics being OP is that you can make almost anything work. See about half of my XCX videos on this channel as proof. However, despite this, there are still multiple flaws in the combat system, and that comes inherently with having such an unbalanced system and so many strong mechanics. And speaking of strong mechanics, I think it's about time we started talking about Overdrive. Overdrive Combat. So, Overdrive is the main reason why I think that ground combat in XCX is the best in the series. It's something that takes time to get good at, opens up a world of possibilities for builds, is an active and real-time centralizing mechanic, as opposed to things like chain attacks in the other games, which give infinite time to think about your decisions. However, the system has more than its fair share of issues, so instead of talking about the good, let's start talking about those. First and most obvious is the art spam. While yes, you do have to take some thought into deciding which arts to use and when, if you have a decent defensive option, which the game has about 1 million to pick from, just see the previous subsection, you really don't have to think that much as long as the buff that's keeping you alive is active. Just click your DPS arts when they have their tertiary cooldown, and your purple arts when you need more TP. Overdrive makes cooldowns so short that you can basically constantly be using arts on tertiary cooldown with no auto-attacking when the overdrive count is at max. Next is the invalidation of plenty of other mechanics, mostly Skell combat, by how good overdrive makes ground combat. Now, Skell combats are definitely still good, and I know even in super optimized play, Skell have their uses. However, ground combat has so many good options for support, defense, and offense that it basically removes any incentive to use Skell since ground combat is simply better in almost every way. Additionally, it takes significantly less effort to get a good ground build than a good Skell build, making the ground combat both better and more accessible. Non-Overdrive Combat. Next, let's talk about my problems with the ground combat whenever you don't have overdrive. First, the combat is kind of boring. Art cooldowns are very long, and since secondary cooldowns give such a massive boost to damage, you'll usually want to wait those out too. This leads to you just sitting there auto-attacking enemies while waiting for cooldowns, blowing them up with a set of aura boosted arts, then going back to not doing anything for the next minute or so. You unlock overdrive at the end of chapter 5, so you can start speeding things up and getting to really play the game before too long, but it doesn't change how slow combat can feel outside of overdrive. I've played a decent amount of the game without overdrive, including some post-game stuff for personal challenge, but I've just never really found non-overdrive combat to be very enjoyable. To me, if overdrive combat is the best combat in any Xenoblade game, XCX's combat without overdrive is probably the worst. Overdrive's explanation. The in-game explanation of overdrive, if you can even call it that, is completely worthless. Upon unlocking overdrive, you're basically just told, hey, you've unlocked this mechanic called overdrive, it's sure to be useful. For such a complicated core mechanic with a lot of details to it, this is basically worthless. Now, once you get an understanding for how overdrive works, it isn't that complicated to execute. However, there's not really any feasible way for you to learn how overdrive works from what the game tells you or just from messing around with it in casual play. I don't know if the manual has information on how overdrive works in detail, but I don't exactly consider that to be a suitable substitute for the game giving you some form of proper tutorial or explanation. I think I had over 150 hours in XCX and had found a video that used an overdrive build before I really understood anything about overdrive, and up until that point I'd mostly just thought of it as a waste of 3000 TP that could instead go to things like TP arts or auras. Even after this though, I didn't fully understand it because it's not the easiest mechanic to fully understand from just seeing it used in 1 or 2 fights, and when the game first came out, there weren't a lot of resources or videos showcasing high-level gameplay yet. It took me until around 250 hours to really understand overdrive and to be able to start making my own builds. Now, getting into the game and learning overdrive now is not as bad as it was back then, because things like Anel's overdrive guide and various Reddit posts make it somewhat easy to find well-made resources explaining the mechanic. However, if it takes an almost 20-minute video from a source outside of the game to understand the centralizing combat mechanic, there's something seriously wrong with how you're conveying it to the player. General Skell Combat. Time to move on from ground combat and start talking about Skell combat. I have a lot less to say about this since honestly, Skell combat is a lot less involved than ground combat. However, I still have a fair few complaints about it in a fair few different areas. First, I want to talk about disc bombs. Now, I do know that this is a glitch, but I do want to bring up how dumb it is that one of the, if not the strongest, Skell builds in the game is literally just auto-attacking with sidearms. The thing is with this glitch is that it affects basically any Skell build for level 50 plus Skells, as any Skell with the level 50 plus frame can make use of disc bombs for incredibly easy TP generation. While there are other good Skell builds which might work better in certain situations or for fun, they typically still use disc bombs because disc bombs are simply the best sidearm in the game. Next, let's talk about the problem of infinite Skell overdrive. So unlike ground combat, Skells have very limited ways to infinitely tank enemy attacks. These are basically limited to reflect and resistance stacking plus healing, one of which is only available with Skell overdrive and only on certain Skell frames, while the other is greatly aided by an overdrive that's only on one Skell frame. Additionally, this means that any Skell that has an overdrive that either doesn't help with one of these two defensive options, boosts an offensive stat, or both is inherently outclassed. Specifically, the most common Skells to use are Laya for resistance stacking, debuff immunity and healing, Varys for reflect and melee attack up, or Mystima and Inferno for reflect and ranged attack up. You can make other Skells work, and I have in my own time, but most other Skells are simply outclassed by these either defensively, offensively, or both. Additionally, Inferno and Mystima basically have the best overdrive in the game since the increase to ranged attack benefits both the good super weapons and disc bombs, while Laya and Inferno both have 6000 base GP, meaning they can maintain infinite overdrive without investing in max GP drive augments. The issues of Skell combat are further compounded by the accuracy and evasion system in this game, which I'll be talking about in greater detail in a later subsection. To keep it brief here though, because evasion is capped at 95%, evasion tanking isn't feasible for fighting strong enemies, making light, high evasion Skells basically worthless unless they have other ways to survive. This is one of the things that limits practical Skell builds, and one of the reasons why the aforementioned Skells are the only real viable frames for good Skell builds. Caps on accuracy and evasion. Hard caps on accuracy and evasion are annoying for a number of reasons. These mostly relate to how they make certain kinds of strategies inconsistent when they otherwise wouldn't be. Namely, topple locking and evasion tanking builds are both made significantly less consistent by the way evasion and accuracy are capped. For those who don't know, accuracy and evasion in this game are both capped at 95%. That is to say, you will always have at least a 5% chance of missing your attacks and a 5% chance of getting hit by enemies. Against normal enemies, this isn't that big of a deal since they usually don't have the strength to kill you in a single hit. However, against strong enemies, it makes certain strategies that rely on consistently hitting, or consistently dodging, incredibly inconsistent. As an example, against Gradivis, topple locking is a relatively decent strategy. It works well for helping characters or builds with less damage potential survive the fight and keep him unable to fight back. However, Gradivis can become enraged, and when he does this, he becomes immune to topple. Additionally, he moves greatly to the side when toppled, meaning you'll want to wait until he's getting up to refresh the topple. This means that every time you need to topple Gradivis, you're risking a miss, which can lead to you losing the run and dying due to him becoming immune to topple. Similarly, evasion becomes quite inconsistent against most super bosses. Evasion builds against strong enemies tend to make use of Blackout, as this tends to be more efficient and consistent than simply stacking evasion forever. However, when fighting strong enemies with evasion builds, you need to invest somewhat into your attribute resistances since evasion isn't consistent enough over a longer battle. If you don't have a secondary way of surviving the strong attacks from those enemies, you'll likely just be one-shot randomly at some point in the fight due to the fact that evasion works in this way. Buff and debuff indicators. This one's a bit of a personal gripe, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. On your party members, only one buff and one debuff will be displayed at a time. Additionally, the icons for buffs and debuffs aren't particularly easy to tell what they are if you haven't looked them up or memorized them. Combine this with the fact that there can be a large number of buffs and debuffs on your character at one time with weather, data probes, auras, normal buffs and debuffs from the fight, and it can be very difficult to actually know what the active buffs and debuffs on your character are. Even if you do know what every buff and debuff icon is, they scroll so slowly that it can be difficult to actually figure out if certain debuffs are inflicted against you or not, or if some of your own buffs are active or need to be refreshed. Enemy Reflect and Spike. Enemy spikes and reflects are similar to my complaint in the XCDE section, except without the caveat that it's nice that you can at least tell which enemies have spikes in that game. Basically, the problem I take with spikes and reflects is that there is no in-game indicator to show when enemies have them, so you either have to die figuring it out or look it up for every enemy you fight just to be sure. Additionally, this game has pretty limited counterplay to spikes in general. The main ways around spikes are to either run anti-spike augments, of which are completely useless outside of specifically fighting enemies with spikes, and only help against that one thing, and you also need to invest 2 augments of them, or to stack enough attribute resistance to mitigate the spike damage, or run a Reflect to reflect the spike damage back at the enemy. Reflect has even less counterplay. The only option is to either run a Nullify Reflect attribute augment, or a different attribute altogether, the latter of which doesn't even work against that one Zedom Tyrant who reflects all attributes. Again, this would be less annoying if you could at least tell it was coming, but even that slight silver lining doesn't exist. You not only have limited ways of dealing with it, but you also have no in-game way to know it's coming until it's already too late. Wir Fliegen. This is basically going to be my Visions React complaint from the Vision subsection of XC1. Why does Wir Fliegen overwrite every other combat theme in the entire game? It's definitely a good song, but since Overdrive is a mechanic you're reasonably going to be using in every fight when you're good at the game, either on foot or in Skell, it really sucks to not be able to enjoy any of the other good combat themes in the game. There are combat themes in this game that I didn't know existed until I listened to the game's full OST a while back. This is in large part due to Wir Fliegen being the only battle theme I heard for the vast majority of my time playing the game. While this might seem like a nitpick, seriously try playing this game for a few hundred or potentially even few thousand hours and tell me this doesn't start to get a little bit annoying. The E-Manual. Why is this a thing? Why does this game have this big-ass manual to read in order to learn the mechanics instead of just having decent tutorials? I'll be real honest, I've never used the manual in this game, so I don't know how useful it actually is. However, reading a manual is one of the least enjoyable ways to learn about a game. The best way to teach a player is through the gameplay itself, and if that's not possible, a coherent tutorial explaining the mechanic would be preferred to this. I get that there's a lot of detail to some of this game's mechanics like overdrive, but there has to be a better solution than this. Additionally, as a personal nitpick, why does the E-Manual take so long to open when you accidentally click on it in the menu? It just wastes so much time for no reason. Blood Lobster. This is the single worst quest in the entire series. I've done this quest twice, and both times I used a guide, and both times it sucked. Who thought that it was a good idea to make a quest that's hide and seek with 100 small objects that are hard to see? A lot of these are hidden in out of the way spots too, if I recall correctly. This quest just sucks and has no redeeming qualities. I don't really have much more to say about it than that, but I wanted this to be in the video because man do I hate this quest. Characters with potential. Honestly, a lot of characters in this game got the short end of the stick due to how bad the plot is. So many characters in this game seem like they could have been interesting if only they'd been developed better, but they only had a few short chapters, most of which focused only on the main crew of Lau, Lin, and Elma to exist for, plus their Affinity missions. This is really unfortunate because some of the characters show they had some really interesting traits, then they're just never fleshed out due to these limitations. My personal example for this is Doug. If I recall correctly, Doug has some moments in his Affinity missions that discuss his father's debts and his desire to pay them off. Additionally, there's some reference to how he knew Lau from before the boarding of the White Whale. Both of these could have been pretty interesting and given him some decent character development if only they had had the time to properly flesh out and build upon this. Too bad they didn't. Another canned example of this is Elle. Elle is honestly one of the more interesting characters in the game, and just nothing happens with him. You find him in the forest, he talks about his thirst for knowledge and he speaks like he's a collective, then he just stops being relevant to the plot at the end of that chapter. Sure, you get a little bit more information about him from his Affinity missions, but you don't learn anything that helps answer the questions about him or really develops him that much. He just ends up being that guy who messes up figures of speech. Also on the topic of Elle, we know Dawn. I could keep going on about this and give a few more examples, but I think that you get my point by now. This is just one of the biggest downsides of the game not really having an impressive story. The characters in this game aren't even that bad, they just don't really get the opportunity to shine or really stand out, aside from the few characters who are more directly important to the plot. Antagonists. On the topic of characters with potential, let's talk about the antagonists in this game. The antagonists in this game suck, and that's not even just in the sense that they're uninteresting. There's not even anything about them to get interested in because you never even get the chance to know anything about them. This goes in two ways. The first is the extremely obvious one, the fact that the game simply doesn't explain much about them. The Ganglion are a group who oppose you for the entire game, and all you really know about their motives is that they want to kill humans because they hate humanity. The game doesn't even really explain why by the end of the game, and you still have to piece a decent amount of it together yourself. While I know that the plot is not the strong point of this game, the way the antagonists are handled is almost insultingly bad. The other way that you don't get to know anything about the antagonists is a lot simpler. They all die before you learn anything about them. Guida and Reese are your two main antagonists before Luxar, and they both basically die after you've met them twice. Luxar himself you basically kill in what is essentially your first real confrontation with him. There's just no real time to develop these characters because they simply aren't around long enough to be developed. Cliffhanger Ending. Okay, I know that this game had some developmental issues. I get that. But the ending of this game is still pretty terrible. Getting some cutscene of the life hole being destroyed on the inside and Lau waking up on a beach with no resolution to either is quite the cliffhanger. and there's no real indication that there will ever be a sequel to XCX to resolve these things. Now, let me be clear here. Even if we had a sequel to continue from this cliffhanger, that wouldn't make this ending any less offensively bad. This cliffhanger would still be a terrible ending to a game, since all it does is create more questions and contradict everything that the game has been building up to for the entire plot. However, it will at least give some form of closure, which the ending is currently lacking. The fans. This isn't explicitly related to the game, but it's something I feel like is worth mentioning. Honestly, the fans of Xenoblade Chronicles X are some of the most annoying people out there, and they can really make it difficult to get into the game due to how annoying it is to interact with other fans of the game. They can't take any criticism of their game, tend to be kind of elitists, and throw a hissy fit anytime literally anyone has anything bad to say about their game. This game is generally good, but it's definitely not perfect. Fans of this game need to both learn that, and learn that they don't need to pick a fight every time someone says that their game is not God's gift to gaming. Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Okay, so let's get all the low-hanging fruit out of the way first. Greg's design bad, too anime, Booba bad, the bedroom cutscene, blushy crushy, one-eyed monster, sluggish combat, Greg screams like ah! Various characters are annoying, and arguably most importantly, Anel likes this game, which automatically makes it lose like 20% of its score on whatever rating system as a minimum. So are all the 12-year-olds from Twitter who have nothing interesting or insightful to say about the game satisfied? Good, let's move on to my actual complaints then. Full disclosure that XC2 is the game that I have played the least by far. Granted, I've still played this game for over 400 hours, so I do have a decent amount of experience with it, and least by far is a relative term. Because of this, I probably won't be as hard on it as I am with some of the other games with respect to some things, and I will be harder on it with respect to others, and I will be doing a decent amount of speaking to its defense on some of my criticisms. If people who know the game better, such as Anel, Quad, Xenoblade, Shem, TJ, Tyler, or basically anyone else who's played this game for a decent amount of time, wants to make their own video where they list off their personal issues with the game and or just tell me why everything I say is wrong, I openly encourage it. Additionally, I want to be upfront about this as well. XC2 is the only game that I rewatched the cutscenes for in preparation of this video. This came from the fact that I'd only watched through the cutscenes once when the game first came out about 4.5 years ago, and means that my criticisms of the game will be based on a more recent viewing than for the other two games. While I've definitely watched the other games' cutscenes relatively recently, XC2 is the only one that I rewatched specifically for this video, so it's likely I'll be more critical in terms of characters and story than I've been towards the other games. I don't think that this makes my criticisms any less valid, but I did want to be transparent about this, as much more of this section is going to be story focused compared to the other two games, which were primarily gameplay focused. There's also probably going to be a lot of me repeating myself, since I feel like a lot of the problems with the story and characters in this game are related and stem from similar places. Additionally, I will be giving my actual thoughts on several of the common criticisms against this game, even though a lot of people probably feel like they're brought up too often already. This video is supposed to encompass all issues I can think of with these games, and I'm not going to let things slide just because XC2 has been the butt of some people's jokes since it launched. I'm not going to be complaining about things like game/plot to anime, because I don't really feel like that's a useful criticism personally. I will complain about some tropey things, but that's about it. Now that we've got the ground rules, context, and disclaimers out of the way, let's get into my criticisms. Combat. The combat in this game, whenever you actually know what you're doing, can definitely be fun. However, the game does just about everything in its power to keep you from knowing what you're doing. I'm not going to rant on this for too long, but outside of tutorials being bad and not explaining things well, my biggest gripe has to be with step cancelling. Also, since this comment doesn't really fit anywhere else in the script, I'm just going to say it now. Step cancelling improves XC2's combat, but it doesn't make it crazily interactive or anything. It makes it marginally better than waiting for art cooldowns at best, and that's about it. From what I remember, the game frames building up the 3-hit combo of auto attacks is what you should be doing, and is a good way to increase your damage. However, this is basically just wrong and pretty much useless in practice unless you want to cancel into an art from a higher hit of an auto attack. To me, this is the game essentially indicating that step cancelling is an exploit of the system rather than a part of the system itself. It exists in the game and makes the combat more enjoyable, so at the end of the day it's fair game, but it's one of those things that really indicates to me how either the game is actively misleading the player, the devs don't understand the combat system that they built, or that they were just really bad at conveying things to the player. There's a few other problems I have with XC2 Combat, but they typically only apply to the early game. The length of time it takes to actually be able to fully interact with all the combat mechanics is quite long, and stops you from being able to actually use the mechanics and enjoy the combat. Additionally, the combat just feels pretty sluggish and is annoying to use until you get the ability to cancel arts and do other arts, especially when replaying the game after getting used to being able to do so. Next, there's the complaint that I've had for basically all the games and all the combat systems so far, which is that, quote, optimal gameplay isn't that fun. In this case, it's probably not actually, quote, optimal gameplay, since I'm not good enough at the game to know what optimal gameplay actually is, but I feel like my point still stands if it's the best I could find, or learn from other people, after over 400 hours of playing the game. In this case, the gameplay I'm talking about is art spamming with arts recharge pouch items and crit heal. On normal mode, which is what I've spent most of my time with the game playing, a good crit heal build on someone like Poppy Cutie Pie is enough to just carry you through everything in post-game in the Land of Challenge alone, between its infinite damage and healing. Again, the problem isn't that this is too strong. I know that builds like this are less sustainable on the higher difficulty settings. The problem is that this gameplay is pretty brain dead. This was enough for me to complete all of the Land of Challenge missions on normal and beat all of the super bosses, and it wasn't really that fun since there was no challenge or thought to the gameplay itself. Finally, I just want to acknowledge the lack of balance with some of the higher custom difficulty settings in Bringer of Chaos. Now, I'm not good enough at the game to really mess around with these higher difficulty settings much, but my little bit of playing with them was enough to know that they completely throw the balance of the rest of the game out of whack. Even if some people might find these to be a fun challenge, and I do think that having any difficulty settings is better than no difficulty settings, I don't feel like this changes my criticism of them. Weapon points. So this is a pretty simple complaint and might even be seen as nitpicking, but I wanted to include it because I don't like it and that's what this video is all about. To keep it brief, the fact that weapon points are exclusive to each weapon, rather than something such as BP and XCX, which allow for upgrading of any weapons arts, is really annoying and indirectly limits your choices for what to use. While it doesn't directly limit you, since you can either just grind WP on weapons you want to start using, or tack on a single blade of a type that you want to grind weapon points on, it does limit your freedom to switch which weapons you're using to ones that you haven't tried yet, since you're always starting from 0 WP and level 1 arts. This isn't the biggest deal in the world because of things like the aforementioned grinding or deal with it options, but it is something that limits your options in experimentation. Well, this isn't a problem in late game, as you can either trade bonus EXP or just grind weapon points super easily. It is a problem for the majority of the casual playthrough. When a core mechanic of the game is the gacha system and getting random blades and switching those blades to suit your current needs, something like weapon exclusive weapon points is just simply restricting when it has no real reason to be. The gacha system. So, the blade gacha system in this game has really been beaten to death with criticism, so I'll just keep to what I think is relevant for me to say in my personal experiences. I've played a huge amount of both Xenoblade Chronicles X and Definitive Edition, getting super into the combat and sinking well over 1,000 hours into each. However, the gacha system in this game is more or less the only reason why I haven't gotten into the combat in this game outside of things like crit heal Poppy Cutie Pie go brr. Now, let's talk about the good before I continue on with the bad. For a casual playthrough, the gacha system is actually not that terrible, as it allows you to have a largely unique experience compared to other players, and replaying the game will likely lead you having a different set of blades to build around. However, that's about where the positives end in my eyes. The biggest issue with me isn't getting all the rare blades when trying to get into the combat in depth. That's something that can be accomplished reasonably quickly if you grind efficiently. What I take issue with is the skills which are pretty important to high-level gameplay being gated behind common blades. Even if this wasn't the case exactly, the fact that specific common blades are really important to high-level builds is just simply annoying and off-putting. Additionally, even outside of combat-related things, this would still be an annoying mechanic for the purpose of field skills, which we'll be talking about shortly. I could ramble on about this for way longer, but I feel like this should be enough to get my point across. I do also want to put the disclaimer that I have still wanted to get into the combat in this game in greater detail, despite the gacha system, and my issues with it. However, because of it, I've simply never been able to justify investing the time when I could be doing something else instead. Field skills. I personally feel like field skills were a really interesting idea. It's an interesting way to get certain areas out, to allow shortcuts when you have certain blades, or to encourage you to rotate to different blades depending on the field checks required. However, it just ends up being really annoying in practice. Field checks that you already have the blades for don't encourage you to run a different combination of blades. They effectively just have you switch to the required loadout, clear the check, then go back to whatever you had before. Field checks for story progression are just bad, and I'm not even going to try to defend them, as you simply can't progress without meeting your stat check. Overall, I don't hate this mechanic as much as some people do. That being said though, I wouldn't mind if this mechanic was dropped and never returns to the series. Exploring. This is mostly just personal preference, but I feel like the movement and exploration in this game can feel a bit clunky. The areas themselves are good and fun to explore and wander around in, but the actual walking around is what I take problem with. Similarly to how I complained about walking speeds without quickstep in XCDE, this game has a similar problem when you don't have the movement speed deeds. Additionally, I find the jump in this game to be a little bit awkward and uncomfortable to control and explore with. Overall, the experience of exploring feels pretty good in this game, and it's something that I did very much enjoy in it, but these few things definitely did detract from it in my eyes. Enemy aggro indicators. Enemy aggro indicators being removed from the game is something that I view as strictly bad. I've heard some of the justification before launch of making you understand the world better and learn which kind of enemies are threats, but that just simply doesn't sell me on it. Overall, this is just kind of a reduction of information compared to the other games in the series, and it makes the world and environment more annoying to traverse. I don't really have much more to say in terms of the implications of this or how it affects the games as a whole. It's mostly just an isolated issue that I feel hampers the game. Tutorials. Most people seem to think that these are the worst things in the universe, but honestly I just feel like they're a bit meh. There's definitely some things about them that are annoying, such as not being able to view them again later, and them being front-loaded to parts of the game where you won't really get to use the mechanics much for a while. However, on my blind playthrough, I thought they did a good enough job of teaching me the combat system. Part of this might be that XC2 really doesn't have the most complicated combat system in the world if you aren't trying to min-max things though. Either way, the tutorials do kind of suck, but they aren't really the end of the world. General storytelling. Overall, I feel like the storytelling in this game is pretty good, and I do feel like it gets a bad rap from people who've only played the first sections of the game. However, I'm not making this video to talk about the good parts of these games, and the problems I do have are with those first few sections. Early on, many of the characters' motivations haven't been revealed yet, and a lot of the characters haven't been well developed, and just in general, it's difficult to get too attached. If the game doesn't give players a reason to care about some of these characters or the story, most people just simply won't. Take for example characters like Mythra when she first joins in Chapter 4 or whenever it was, where you don't really have much of a reason to like her because she's kind of a bitch, and the fact that she's kind of a bitch and super arrogant gets reinforced in the next few areas. And then there's things like the bedroom scene that I'm not going to dwell on because literally nobody even tries to defend it. Or for example, take the members of Torna, who none of their motivations are really explained at all, and they're just kind of generic bad guys who want Pyra because he's just powerful for the first long while of the game. Or characters like Zeke, who are just the random comic relief character you have no reason to care about. Or even characters like Rex, who do receive some decent characterization and motivations early on, but are left relatively uninteresting and underdeveloped for a decent portion of the game. By the way, this will be a recurring theme throughout the XC2 section, where the front half of the game's lackluster appearance, storytelling, and character development weigh down the game in a way that I personally feel like the later parts of the game struggle to compensate for. We'll be talking about this in more detail throughout some of the upcoming subsections, though. Not explaining plot points. Overall, I think that the story, pacing, and characters in this game are pretty good. A lot of surface level information for motivation for Rex's general goals, general information about the world, and baseline driving forces are all set up relatively early on, and various different characters' motivations are established and built upon throughout the story. However, there's a pretty decent amount of things that are left annoyingly ambiguous for large portions of the game. I won't go into too much detail on all the cases of this because that's just simply not within the scope of this video, but things such as why Mythra is such a bitch early on, why characters such as Pyra, Jin, Malos, Nia, Gramps/Azurda, and Amalthus are the way they are, and why so many of them know each other, and several other things are introduced so far before any of them are explained that most players will have forgotten about them or just simply lost interest in them by the time they come around to being explained. Let me be clear, there's a difference between the game not telling a character's entire backstory at the drop of a hat and leaving the player too in the dark on certain things. Early on, it's alluded to that Nia doesn't have a family and is alone, but this isn't really explained until Spirit Crucible Elfies. However, certain things like this tend to be tied to character development and growth. This is very different in my eyes from whenever the game more or less doesn't explain anything about the Torna crew or Pyra/Mythra for the majority of the game. Even the parts of the game where there is exposition, nothing really gets explained. Take for example the fight against Malos and Akos, and the cutscenes surrounding it. There's a decent amount of exposition where you learn a bit about the Torna crew and how they know Pyra and what Jin wants, but at the end of the day it doesn't really answer any questions. It only really begs more. Even the parts that explain things during moments like this don't really explain anything or give the player any new information. They're usually just vague statements or rewording of things you already know. You could argue that this makes people want to continue playing, to have those questions answered, but a good story gives its viewers something when it asks something of them. If you want to keep people's attention, you have to give them meaningful information that leads to these new questions. You can't just present a new question and give the viewers nothing to go off of. This just leads to frustration and loss of patience, as the story keeps asking you to give it more time without actually giving you any answers or information for itself. This would be one thing if it was an isolated incident, but it's simply not. It's a recurring thing for several chapters, with many characters and a ton of different cutscenes. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some things that make a lot more sense to hide from players, both narratively and for the sake of building up tension and building up to specific moments. It makes sense narratively that the bad guys don't want to explain everything they know to Rex, for a lot of really obvious reasons. But I don't feel like that's enough to lessen how frustrating it can be to just not understand things on your first playthrough of the game. This is also probably why the second playthrough of this game in particular is so much more worthwhile than the other games in this series, as there's multiple points in the story where things from later in the story are alluded to early on, and there's some small detail that gains decent significance when you actually know what's happening, or other things of a similar nature, but you won't really know their significance until you have the full picture. Unfortunately for the game though, the full picture isn't gained until quite late, and by then you'll have forgotten about most of these moments, and most people just simply aren't going to go back and rewatch 14 hours of cutscenes so they can understand what's going on. The lack of specific detail can be to the game's benefit at times, with things like the vague, differing characterizations between Nia versus Jin and Malos, despite them working together, helping to get players interested in the story and characters without explicitly spelling things out for the player, or the earlier mention of the Aegis and implications of its importance without giving explicit explanation as to what it really is. However, there are still several points where I find myself frustrated with the game for being a bit obtuse as to the characters and plot points that it just doesn't want to explain yet, specifically towards the mid-game, regardless of whether or not the game has a good reason to withhold this information. That being said, there are a good amount of things that are set up for character development and motivation early on, such as Rex sending money home, not wanting to deal with salvaging for weaponry, and his motivations for salvaging / wanting to go to the World Tree. While I understand why they explain things like this and not things relating to the Aegises, as one is a simple character development for Rex and the other is a major plot point for large portions of the game, there are still several points relatively late in the game where I feel like things weren't being explained well or as early as they should. This mostly pertains to things such as Pyra and Mythra and the Torna crew, but I'll avoid going into any specific details. Finally, I do want to say that after rewatching all the cutscenes, this overall is not as bad as I remembered it. I will never say that this is not a problem, as basically every cutscene involving Torna just creates more confusion to a blind player than it resolves, but a decent amount of other things in the game are explained better than I originally remembered. That being said, I felt like it was important to include this section and talk at length about this, as it's something that detracted quite a bit from the game on my personal first playthrough, and it's something that I still view as a strong negative, even if it's not as bad as I originally thought. All of this to say, this game has its good moments of foreshadowing and its bad moments. It has its good moments of explaining things at good times, and it has its bad moments where players are left in the dark for what feels like way too long. Awkward scenes. So I'm not going to spend too long on this because this topic has been beaten to death, but I do feel like it's at least important to acknowledge it and discuss some. First and foremost, let's establish that this is not a problem throughout the entire game, and most people do blow it a bit out of proportion. However, it is something that I do see as a problem in the game, and it's something that I want to give my general thoughts on. It would be a waste of time to bring up every cutscene that is awkward for one reason or another. However, suffice to say, there are a large number of them in the first half of the game. In the first few chapters, there are so many awkward moments in the cutscenes that on my blind playthrough, I had to pause multiple times to deal with the second-hand cringe. Sometimes this game is able to play them off relatively well, and it leads to some good comic relief. For example, I personally don't really take any issue with the cutscenes like the One-Eyed Monster, Zeke wanting compliments in Leftheria, or even the Poppy introduction cutscene, as I personally find the humor in them outweighs the awkwardness. However, there are other times where things just fall flat and it just simply makes things really awkward, and it's likely one of the primary reasons why so many people judge this game as poorly as they do, especially considering how loaded the early parts of the game are with these cutscenes. All that being said, I do think that this is far from the largest issue in the game, even if we're only looking at story/cutscene related things. Most of the scenes like this are in the first half of the game, which in my opinion is generally the weaker portions of the story. Most of this is absent from the later parts of the game, which is where the story gets quite a bit better in my opinion. Voice acting. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because overall I think the voice acting in this game is pretty good. However, it would be dishonest to not at least acknowledge and pay lip service to the various inconsistencies in the quality of the voice acting throughout the game, sometimes even within the same cutscene. An example I don't see talked about much is how Jin talks really fast, snappily, and in a really unnatural way in the early parts of the game. There are things that can be said to explain why he does this in terms of his character later on, but it doesn't change how jarring and somewhat off-putting it can be during those early parts of the game, during which people are making their initial impressions. And also, well, just listen to Rex's screams during Chapter 1 and compare them to Shulk's during the Mechon attack on Colony 9. I think it's easy to understand why some people are so hard on this game's voice acting when it starts off so weak compared to what most people were likely expecting. I also want to make a specific point of how for a decent number of cutscenes, the voices don't at all match what's happening during the scene itself, i.e. the tone, the way it's presented verbally, etc. I know that there have been plenty other people who have talked about this and that there are some reasons for it, so you can go find other videos on that if you're interested, as I won't really be talking about it here. This is more of an inclusion because I felt like it was worth mentioning, rather than because it's something I personally feel strongly about, as it didn't detract too much from me on my first playthrough. Asspulls. About halfway through the game, Jin shows he has the ability to control all elementary particles and move at the speed of light, and he's just like, don't worry about it or how I didn't use these powers to kill you and all the witnesses at the start of the game, or why this hasn't come up during any of our confrontations before now. Plot had to happen first. Honestly, this whole cutscene is kind of a mess, and there's way more to go into that's outside of the scope of this video, so I'm just going to be keeping it to the Jin side of things for this point. Now, things like this, where some plot point that would have been relevant earlier only comes up later, are pretty common in JRPGs in general, and are often somewhat needed for the narrative to have a decent flow. However, they happen with such regularity as this game progresses, and are so out of the blue and incongruent to other things happening in the plot that they simply just detract from it in my eyes. Also on the topic of Jin, we know Dawn. I know that the game does some things to try and explain what the fuck is actually happening in these situations and give justification as to why it works, but at the end of the day, I don't think that that's really what matters. The problem isn't just, Jin is stupidly strong for no reason, or, we didn't bring this up earlier because plot. The issue with these types of things is basically being dropped with no warning and completely derailing the current arc of the story for whatever stupid thing is happening now. My biggest gripe with these issues, and while some people might not even consider them Asspulls as I'm elegantly putting it, is that many points towards the later part of the game aren't properly built or developed into. It just feels like they're springing up out of the blue, even for the ones that have had some hinting to early on, or some minor build-up. None of these are that big of a deal individually, but they just tend to taint the parts of the game that aren't already tainted by a bunch of the earlier game story issues. Overall, I don't want to dwell on this for too long. I'm trying not to just ramble off examples in this video, but suffice to say there's a fair few times that things like this happen in the second half of the game. While it isn't nearly as frequent as some of the other points I've made, or as big of an annoyance, the times that it does happen tend to be pretty offensive, relatively large, detract quite a bit from the coherency of the story, and are just generally completely out of the blue, which is what I take issue with. They give the story this feeling of just being all over the place in the later portions, which I don't think I need to explain why that's a bad thing. I also want to make a point that while many of the other issues I have with the story of this game are prevalent early on, then disappear later on, this tends to be the opposite. This type of plot point out of nowhere is a big problem that I have with the later parts of the game, and I didn't find it all that bad in the first half, but it starts occurring shortly after those other problems start to disappear. Character development. I've talked about this in a few other sections, so I don't want to spend too much time on it here. I actually don't have too much to complain about here myself, as I overall think the characters in this game are very good. However, I wanted to bring it up since it seems to be a common complaint people have about the game. Also, to be upfront, I'm going to be disregarding characters like Abrona or Vandam, who generally just don't really contribute much to the story on a larger scale because they basically exist for one chapter. I think a large part of this issue is just as simple as some characters are developed well early on, while others are developed poorly at first and have some level of redemption or growth later on. Some characters are given one characterization early on, then show that they are a lot more than that as the story progresses, and some characters are Torah. This is a problem because by the time the characters have received their development or growth, the damage has already been done and the well has already been poisoned. This is really unfortunate because this game has a lot of characters that are really good and well developed, but many people won't truly get to experience it because a lot of it is loaded into the back half of the game, at which point people have already made up their minds about the different characters. Overall, I think most of the characters in this game are very good. Even some characters like Rex, which I am about to bash, I think are overall pretty interesting characters, and are well developed throughout the game. However, there's certain ways that the game presents characters that I think makes it hard to like them despite this. This mostly relates to things like Rex being presented as just some dumbass kid for most of the game, despite being relatively well developed in terms of motivations and such, and Mythra being presented as overly arrogant and bitchy for no apparent reason for quite a while after she's introduced. Both of these things make people dislike these characters, or at least give them reasons to dislike them, long before they have the chance to really develop, which in turn makes many people dislike these characters the whole game, even after they've received said development. As with most of the complaints relating to story and characters, this issue mostly resolves itself either by or during the later half of the game. However, not bringing it up would feel dishonest, since it's something that has affected my enjoyment of the game, as well as being something that I know that some of my friends have talked about during their blind playthroughs, meaning I know that this isn't just a me thing. Rex specifically. I wanted to briefly talk about the issues I see with Rex as a protagonist and how this affects the game/story as a whole. While Rex certainly does have his moments of being a really good character, for large portions of the game a few glaring issues persist. Rex flips between having characters talk to him about how weak and useless he is and how he'll never live up to being the driver of the Aegis, then him being a relatively skilled driver and being able to somewhat easily overcome obstacles. He'll flip between being a hot-headed idiot, doing some of the dumbest shit you've ever seen, to being fairly insightful and mature, literally in adjacent cutscenes. Now, I don't think I need to explain why this is jarring when he flips back and forth repeatedly, so instead I'll focus on how this impacts my perception of Rex as a character and how it impacts the story. Because of this, Rex has a difficult time fitting it into any real characterization, and it's difficult at times to see him grow as you would expect since progress is normally followed by regression. With these issues existing for the main character of the game, or at least the person that most players are going to treat as the main character, this makes it difficult to become attached to him, and by proxy, the story as a whole. I could go on all day about specific problems and details I see with Rex, or any number of other characters, but there's really not any point of that in my opinion. Hopefully, these last two sections are enough to get my general thoughts and ideas across, and you can get an idea of various specifics for yourself. Rex-Pyra Mythra relationship. I don't really want to talk about this in great detail, as I don't have much in particular to say about it. I mostly just wanted to bring it up as something I personally find uncomfortable. This isn't even just an I love all you guys think for me. I don't really care about bus girl wars. It's just generally weird, uncomfortable, and makes certain cutscenes and parts of the game less enjoyable to watch. To be a little bit more explicit about what I mean, Rex liking two girls who are kind of the same but also kind of different, and they're both kind of okay with it. And there's several scenes that have them as separate characters in the same place, and Pyra and Mythra are framed as half the time as being two separate people rather than two different personalities or whatever, and so on and so forth, is just really awkward. I'm not exactly a writer or anything, so I don't have any specific suggestions on how to make this less weird, but I feel like they definitely could have handled this whole mess a lot better. Also, since I'm on the topic, and I don't really feel like there's a better place to put this, I feel like the Pyra/Mythra just reappearing at the end of the ending kind of cheapens the impact of what was supposed to be their sacrifice. On my blind playthrough, I felt like it was obvious that this was going to end with them coming back, based on the whole Rex getting the core crystal thing and the way it was framed. But that doesn't change my opinion on it. If anything, it makes it even more annoying, because in my eyes, it makes you know that it's coming throughout the cutscenes they're supposed to be making you feel, based on the fact that they aren't coming back. Side plot points. I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, because I don't feel like there's much to say, but I do feel like it is worth paying lip service to. There's a few side plot points throughout the story that don't really contribute much. On their own, they're not really that offensive and can just be seen as a we need the player to go through this area / get to this boss arena section. However, when combined with some of the other issues, I feel like you can make some parts of the game feel sluggish and just leave the player asking why they're really needing to do this. The most obvious case of this would be the side plot point after Uriah to get Rock's core crystal back and awaken him, but I also feel like this could be applied to a few other sections. While you could argue that these serve either as character or world building, I feel like they ultimately don't contribute much to the story and the game could have been more cohesive without their inclusion. The other major case that I thought of when rewatching the cutscenes was going to get the Omega Feather and Tantal, which while it's less blatant than the Rock one, I feel like it still falls into the same greater issue. The greater issue here is that all of these feel like they were tacked on to cover up certain plot holes or inconveniences. Rock needs to be bonded with Rex before Spirit Crucible Elfies, so that he'd have a blade for the cutscenes while Pyra and Mythra were gone. So they just put on this little side plot point after Vandom died so you have a reason to reawaken Rock while he's still fresh in your memory. You had to get the Omega Feather because the game needed to give you a reason for Ophion to be guarding the World Tree but controllable later, as well as to give you some secluded location to run into the Torna crew at a plot convenient time. Once again, the Omega Feather one is significantly less offensive due to how it actually kind of fits in with other events, but they also didn't really need to be a thing where trying to kill Pyra broke Genbu, which was the plot reason for going to get the Omega Feather. The main problem I take with these is that ultimately they don't really serve any purpose outside of segueing between major plot points, or ensuring gaps / problems won't pop up in the story in other places. While this isn't the biggest deal in the world, I found both of these to be somewhat annoying, so they're going in the video. Awkward animations. So I'm not going to go on this for too long, because my goal is not to list off specific examples. While I know that this could be said to some extent about the other games, and it is in my general problem section, I'm putting it here because I feel like it's most apparent and jarring in this game. There's just so many instances of animations in some cutscenes that just simply look bad. This mostly occurs in cutscenes that are based on the in-game model / animations. I'm not really sure what the exact term for this would be because I'm not a nerd. To give some examples of what I mean for reference, this would include things like how when Rex runs up to the Tricycle in Elysium, he jarringly moves up and down when he runs over the bump, or how every time you're about to enter the fight, all the characters enter their standard weapon draw and idle animations and just kind of stand there, and it's always the exact same animations and perfectly in sync. Or how the running cycles in half the cutscenes is literally just the normal running animation from the overworld, and it looks super stiff in the cutscenes themselves. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to be listing off examples forever, but if you've played this game, or just watched the cutscenes recently, you'll know what I'm talking about. These awkward animations definitely aren't in every cutscene in the game, but they're common enough to be pretty jarring and to detract from the overall product to a significant degree. It's so bad, in fact, that this is the only subsection I felt the need to add specifically after watching the cutscenes, rather than just adding comments to my already existing sections. The fans. This isn't explicitly related to the game, but it's something I feel like is worth mentioning. Honestly, the fans of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 are some of the most annoying people out there, and can make it really difficult to get into the game due to how annoying it is to interact with other fans of the game. They can't take any criticism of their game, tend to be kind of elitists, and throw a hissy fit literally anytime anybody has anything bad to say about their game. The game is generally pretty good, but it's definitely not perfect. Fans of the game need to both learn that, and learn that they don't need to pick a fight every time anybody doesn't think that their game is God's gift to gaming. Torna and Future Connected. So, this video is already incredibly long as is, so I'm just going to be tacking these on together as a mini section at the end. Anything not explicitly mentioned here, just assume that the criticisms from the base games hold for them, i.e. XC2 criticisms carry on to Torna, and XC1 criticisms carry on to Future Connected. This isn't the case for everything, but you can probably figure out some of the ones that apply and some of the ones that don't. Watered down combat. My biggest problem with these two games is that for all intents and purposes, their combat and customization, at least in the case of Future Connected, are simply watered down versions of their base games. While this does make them easier to get into for casual players, and it does give them their own distinct personalities, it also makes them more limited in how far you can push them and how much you can deep dive into them. As stated before, I am less familiar with Torna, so do forgive me if I'm explicitly wrong with anything I'm about to say. However, from my experience, Torna combat was basically just XC2 combat, but you basically always had Orb Master and you didn't have to follow blade combo paths. While this does streamline the combat in some senses, and it does reward people for actually following blade combo paths with better damage, at least I think that's how that works, it does simplify the flow that you need to take through combat in order to beat it. Additionally, the limitation to 3 party members with fixed blade/driver combinations limits customization compared to the base game. Similarly, Future Connected is greatly limited XCDE combat. Chain attacks are gone, which limits the need for art synergy between party members. Gems are limited in availability, and are a bit more of a take what you find sort of mechanic. Visions are gone, making Shield basically useless and limiting the counterplay options you have in a decent number of scenarios. You only have access to 4 party members, greatly limiting options for party compositions and creating synergistic parties. Ultimately, these games are still fun to play in my opinion. However, the more limited options make me significantly less interested in deep diving into their combat systems and really playing around with the systems the games have to offer. Certain systems are more annoying. I'll keep this short because there's not really a whole lot to say here. In Torna, pouch items were more annoying to keep up with because of needing to be crafted rather than being able to buy them. In Future Connected, gems were more annoying because you have basically no control over what you get or how good it is. Both of these make it more annoying to deep dive into their post-game content and try various shenanigans with the combat. People have still done these things for both of these games, but it's definitely more of a hassle than it is for either of their base games. Importance to the main game plot. So this mostly applies to Torna, but if anything from Future Connected is relevant to XC3's story, then it definitely applies to that too. The TLDR of this, since I don't really want to explain the plots of Torna and XC2 for this point alone, is that a stupid and annoying amount of things are important to the base game's plot are put in this side story, let alone paid DLC or the expansion pass or a separate game, or however you want to categorize Torna. Now, this is mostly just a footnote since most of this can just be classified as added character development for both of the games. However, I wanted to make mention of it for Torna specifically, since it does give a lot of background to Jin and his motivations, really fleshing out things that the base game doesn't. I currently don't have any plans to make any follow-ups or responses to this video, but it's not completely off the table to me based on the outcome of this one. Specifically, things like the idea of a video opposite to this one, where I talk about the good things, has crossed my mind while writing the script. However, this is already taking way longer than I planned, and I don't really want to commit myself to any other big projects right now. I hope that this video wasn't too painful to watch. I mean, I'm sure that listening to me criticize these games for a few hours wasn't the most fun to watch, but I mostly mean in terms of the actual audio of it. I'm not really sure how this is going to turn out as I'm writing or recording this, and by the time I'm editing it, I'm not going to want to re-record everything if it doesn't sound good. Additionally, with how I'm recording this, there's a decent chance that my voice volume or tone might change quite a bit randomly and that there might be some awkward pauses, so I'm hoping that there won't be any issues with that. That aside, I do hope that this video gets some people to look at these games in a more critical light, not to be confused with just randomly trashing on them like what will commonly happen on Twitter, and I'm open to anyone responding to this video in any way they see fit. If you want to make a similar video of your own, genuinely argue for or against my points, or just leave an angry comment about how I'm wrong, all are valid and honestly encouraged. I doubt that this video will ever gain any real traction, but please be nice if you involve anyone other than me in discourse relating to this video. I don't really care how you interact with me or this video in particular, I have thick enough skin, but don't drag other people into this and make a mess out of it. With all that out of the way, I have spent far more hours on this video than I intended to already, and I still have to get some background footage and edit it. This video has been a monster of a task to make, and I'm sure that it's been a decent commitment to watch, so genuinely, thank you for your time. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and even if you don't agree with anything I've said, I hope that I've been able to convey some of my opinions on the shortcomings of these games. See you next time.
1, 2, 3, 4.